Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry, and the time has come to talk about one of the most notorious cults in cult history. Cult babes, you already know, we don't normally pause to give trigger warnings. However, just so you are aware, as we cover this cult, we're going to be talking about some disturbing claims of sexual abuse and other systemic exploitation involving children and infants, abuses that weren't just tolerated inside this group, but according to internal publications, were encouraged, normalized, and in some cases, even presented as doctrine. So with that being said, if you're not in the right headspace to receive that information or learn about this cult, it's totally understandable. This is your chance to tap out and head on over to one of our many alien abduction or haunted asylum stories. But the rest of you, if you're here for fucked up cults and the horrifying places they can go, settle in, cult babes, and get ready, because this cult, to me, might be one of the most twisted we've ever covered, and that's saying something. You've probably heard the name Children of God. If you follow pop culture at all, there's a lot of Hollywood crossover here. You might have heard about it. You might even remember we touched on it a while back in the episode about musicians who joined cults, when I talked about how Jeremy Spencer of Fleetwood Mac, who bailed mid-tour in 1971 to join this cult. At one point in time, this intentional community, intentional sect, whatever you want to call it, was crawling with would-be Hollywood stars. This is the same cult that eventually had people like Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan growing up inside its walls. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back a bit. We got to back it up, because none of this will track unless you understand the man who came up with the entire thing, the concept, the rules. We've got to get inside the mind of our cult leader. Any guess on where we're going to start today's story? Well, we're going to start exactly where so many American cult stories start. California in the late 1960s, baby. We're going to Huntington Beach, to be exact. At the time, filled with hippies and surfers, anti-war protesters, all during a time where a whole lot of young people were drifting around with no real sense of what the future held for them. Did they want to go on to start a nuclear family like their own parents? Or was it time for them to experience that new free love movement that was happening? The culture and lifestyles were changing so fast at the time, and as we know from past examples, it created the perfect setting for cults and a lot of these new Christian movements to thrive. And there was one self-appointed prophet at the origins of all of it, who was fluent in counterculture and was ready and willing to gather an impressionable flock of his own, shall we say. That's right, he wanted to start a cult. And he set up shop at a little Christian coffee house called the Light Club, near the Huntington Beach Pier, where he was serving up piping hot cups of born-again salvation with a splash of anti-establishment and a little end-of-the-world fear-mongering to top it all off. How'd he develop such a custom blend? Well, cult babes. And a tale as old as time, he wasn't just some random laid-back, middle-aged bohemian messiah riffing ideological spoken word at a cafe trying to pull barely legal gals. Okay, he was actually a product of a good old hardline Pentecostal revivalism upbringing. His entire childhood conditioning was rooted in the good word. And though he went by many a name over his cult leader career, there was a few name changes in here, which we love. We love a name change. But he started out as David Berg, born in 1919 in Oakland, California. That's right, the town, the 510, to two full-time evangelical parents, Virginia Brandt and Yalmer Berg, who raised him inside a world of miracles, prophecy, obedience, of course, and a little spiritual warfare. That's right. Now, Virginia was the person David later said shaped him more than anyone into becoming the person he later became. She herself had grown up in this very intense Christian household. Her dad, Dr. John Lincoln Brandt, had his own dramatic conversion in his 20s and went straight into full-time ministry and spent years as this Methodist circuit rider before becoming a leader in the Alexander Campbell wing of Disciples of Christ, a kind of dropout anti-establishment church movement that loved beefing with the big denominations at the time. But as she got older, Virginia swung hard in the opposite direction of her parents around the time she was in college, which is a very common thing to happen, right? She's like, no, I'm learning new things. I'm running away from everything that I've ever learned. She became an atheist. She was a quote unquote wild society girl. She was doing a lot of social work at the time to make her life feel more meaningful. But after shattering her back in a horrific accident one day, shortly after the birth of her first child, she spent 5 years basically trapped in bed, often close to death, before having a conversion experience and, in the family story, being miraculously raised off of her deathbed. From there, she and David's father threw themselves into life as a pastor evangelist couple. Think like Tammy Faye, Jim Baker vibes. They were fully committed and not quiet about it at all. Virginia and Hjalmar actually got expelled from the Christian church for publicly preaching her divine healing. That's right, baby. She had the faith healing bug in her. The church didn't like it. It was too off-brand and, well, extreme for their denomination's theology. So they jumped ship. They take off and they start working with the Christian and Missionary Alliance right before our cult leader, David, was born. And even inside that new denomination, their obsession and hatred of church politics kept putting them at odds with different members of leadership. So they mostly operated as this like semi-independent pastor couple, and they dragged their kids along from meeting to meeting. But by the time the Roaring 20s rolled around, they found themselves in Miami after Virginia had led some big revivals at the Miami Gospel Tabernacle. That became their entire family, including David's, home base for the next 14 years. His childhood was basically lived with his mom on stage telling the story of how God had raised her from her deathbed. And every so often, his dad's hopping up there, right? He's preaching judgment and prophecy. And the whole family is living this church-fueled life where they're quite literally living off of church donations and also running on the verge of what some might call spiritual psychosis. They were in Miami for quite some time, but then the timeline gets a little shaky here, depending on the source. The family at some point in the 1930s had to have made their way back to California because that's where David ended up graduating from high school. And he graduated from Monterey High School, so I'm not sure when exactly they returned to California. I just know that that's where all the researchers have stated it's where he got his high school diploma and his high school education. So he was there for at least a couple of years prior to graduating in 1935. And then after he graduates high school, he goes through a very relatable experience for a lot of people, right? He's just very lost. He doesn't really know what he wants to do. And for the next couple of years, he ends up bouncing around, tries to do the normal college route. At one point, briefly attending Occidental College in Los Angeles, but he ended up dropping out, and instead of gaining a degree, he ends up gaining this really big chip on his shoulder. He's all pissed off at the system, right? It's the teachers, it's the institutions, nobody understands him, and it's all corrupt. And to a degree, he's right. School is not designed for everyone. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a very all-inclusive system. That's for sure. This is during a time where they weren't taking anything into consideration. It was either like be normal or get out, right? Be quote unquote normal. By the late 1930s, David had been driven mad. He'd been driven to the brink of mental breakdown after mental breakdown. By the late 1930s, David has a mental breakdown and is sent to a psych ward to receive help. And while some might say, oh, good, you got help, he later looked back at this time and was like, no, they weren't helping me. They were against me. The doctors were trying to suppress me because they knew that I was the receiver of revelations. It's like, okay, Miss David, whatever you say. Clearly didn't help. I don't think they clocked everything at the time. They end up letting him out. And what do you know? 1942 rolls around. World War II hits. He gets drafted and he ends up getting so sick after he gets drafted that he's down for the count. Okay. He's got double pneumonia. He's got heart infections. And according to his later retelling, he nearly died. Yep. He was on the brink of death. Now remember, let's go back to his mom's story about how she almost died and that's when she received the word of God. Well, this is his story. His spiritual awakening where he claimed that while he was lying there sick, he made a vow that if God just let him live, he would serve him full time for the rest of his life. And he did. He recovered. He recovered from the pneumonia, at least, and then was discharged in 1944 because of his heart issues. His illnesses during this time were very much real, but he later spun them to have this deep religiosity behind them. Like, these illnesses while he was in the army were proof that God needed him and was sparing him from doing the labor of going to war. He never actually saw any conflict while he was with the army during those years. And former Children of God members have also later come forward and stated that his illnesses were treated like these sacred happenings from the before times, before he put this group together. But now I think it's time that we got to transition there. Okay, we got to talk about David's rise to becoming a cult leader. And you're going to want to stick with me here because it moves pretty quick. So 1944 is a very busy year. After getting discharged, his next move is he becomes a pastor in the Christian and Missionary Alliance. His parents are obviously stoked by this. It's the family business after all. In that same year, David gets married to this woman he had met named Jane Miller. She was a woman from one of the Alliance churches in Sherman Oaks, California, and they immediately get to work starting a family. Their first child, Deborah, a daughter, was born in 1945, followed by sons Paul and Jonathan, and then finally Faith. In the late 1940s, they were living in rural Arizona, where David was working as a pastor at a tiny Alliance church there. The size didn't matter. An audience is an audience, right? He completely throws himself into it, preaching. He's going around, he's knocking on people's doors. He's doing the whole New Testament church thing. And then he decided he needed to open the doors a little further, okay? If the Bible said there's no Jew or Greek or slave or free, then his congregation shouldn't be segregated either. So he invites local indigenous people, Mexican American families, natives, into what had previously been a mostly white church in Arizona. And to him, it was giving this righteous early civil rights energy. And I actually thought it was pretty interesting because it sort of reminded me of the original Jim Jones Church, where it started out as this effort to bring people together in the name of God, regardless of race. But of course, not everyone was on board with this. To his church board and a chunk of the members, it was heresy. They were pretty furious. They were like, why is this guy coming in trying to fucking stir shit up? Much like his defiant parents back in the day, David was constantly butting heads with church authorities, and over time he built up this low-level paranoia about the system being against him, which we kind of referenced earlier during his first mental breakdown, right? There was a lot of emphasis on the system. He felt like everyone was working against him, trying to stop him from spreading his message. And the system was really this like all-encompassing term for everything from the government, the mainstream churches, therapists, doctors, media, basically anyone who would question him or threaten his control throughout his tenure. But within this church, they ended up butting heads so much that they kicked him out of his own pastorate, right? Like his pastoral office. And so afterwards, he bops through a mix of teaching jobs, does a bunch of odd jobs and freelance evangelism. And then at one point, he finds himself running this little missionary training center, and later even traveled around the US selling television evangelist Fred Jordan's Church in the Home television show to local stations. In 1968, David's basically fed up with the denominational life altogether. There's no more boards, no more elders, no more being hired and fired by anyone but God. With his elderly mother's invitation, he ends up moving his family out to Orange County, near Huntington Beach, and reinvents himself as Uncle Dave, this liberated, wandering prophet preaching to the hippie youth. That'll fucking do it, right? Oh, that's Uncle Dave. He's Unc. I actually love this so much because he builds this whole Christian camp counselor style brand identity as Teens for Christ, and then cycled through a few other rebrands. During a year-long road trip that kicked off in spring of 1969, a reporter in Camden, New Jersey saw David leading his scruffy followers around and described them as Moses and the children of God. And David loved this description, right? And his followers loved it. Children of God. It had such a ring to it. It was way more dramatic and cool and more universal. Anyone can be a child of God. And soon, David had a group of about 50 young Christian disciples who quit their jobs and left their lives to follow him full time. They piled into trucks, vans, campers, and buses. They were crisscrossing the country in caravans. And together, this group, the Children of God, would show up at anti-war rallies and big newsworthy events like the Chicago 7 trial, which was a very highly publicized U.S. federal trial involving 7 anti-Vietnam War activists that were accused of inciting riots during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The Children of God dressed themselves in literal sackcloth, dusted with ashes, carrying staffs, like those long fucking sticks, like shepherds in the Bible, okay? And they would slam their staffs on the sidewalk and shout, "Whoa," at strangers passing by. It's giving theater kid protest vibes, and people in the movement later described it as Jesus freaks on the road, ripping through America, and that's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. And of course, at first, there's good intentions behind all of this, right? I don't think David started off as this evil guy. I think he just had a lot going on in his head that he didn't know how to get out there. But it's a tale as old as time. I mean, if you think about it, cult leaders are kind of always the drunk girl, right? They're the girl who drinks too much. Every cult leader is like, you know what? Let's have fun. Let's do this thing. Let's just go out. Let's just do it, right? But then they always get too fucked up and they just start saying crazy shit. And then everyone's like, oh my God, what the fuck is going on? Except they don't get the anxiety. As is usually part of the cult playbook, next comes communal living. And this was a thing almost immediately. And we're experts here, right, cult babes? We know that's red flag number one. It's the fastest way to isolate people, to dissolve their outside relationships and lives altogether and build total dependency. And King David, one of his many names, didn't waste a second. After that year-long road trek, the first major colonies, as he named them, started to pop up. And one was on an abandoned Christian training ranch in Texas that had belonged to Fred Jordan, called the Texas Soul Clinic. In January of 1970, the Children of God took it over and turned the camp into a 24/7 experiment in Books of Acts living. By that point, the movement had already more than doubled in size to about 120 people, living communally. They were all sleeping in dorm-style cabins, eating in common dining halls, and listening to David lay out his plans for a new society. Because of course they are. The other colony was right in the middle of Skid Row, inside buildings run by Fred Jordan Missions, one of the oldest hunger relief ministries in the city. And from what I can tell, real estate was the extent of Fred Jordan Missions' involvement with the Children of God. Like, they were not co-signing on David's theology whatsoever. I just want to make that clear because I know there's been a few crossover there's already. At this point, the Children of God was its own little universe with its own rules, its own language, and its own hierarchy inside the communes. Everything ran through something called the chain, which was a literal chain of command, a pecking order. Enforcers and submitters. Members pooled their money, surrendered their possessions, gave up privacy and private space, and gave up every part of daily life to leaders above them. Once David had a few dozen communes running and a captive audience hanging on to his every weird little word, his paranoia started to boil over. He believed that the government was watching him. Angry parents were hunting down their runaway kids, and suddenly they were part of the system that was coming to shut him down. So around 1971, he declares himself Moses David, God's end-time prophet. And then he vanished. That's right. David disappeared. He stopped making public appearances. He never showed his face again and drifted between safe houses in Europe, Israel, and North Africa. Even the group's official website admits he chose to live in seclusion and led the entire movement from then on from hiding. So how does a shepherd control the flock if he refuses to stand in front of them? Well, cult babes, don't ever underestimate the power of the good old-fashioned newsletter. This is where the infamous Mo letters come in. He's Moses now, right? Moses' letters. They were like these handwritten, illustrated, deeply deranged sermons that landed in every colony's mailbox like a monthly cult lifestyle magazine subscription, which I'm like, do we need one of those? Okay, I would love to make a zine. Would you subscribe? Let me know. But they looked like the old school DIY zines, very punk, very Oakland of him, to be honest. Think like comic book style sketches with grainy black and white photocopied photos, uneven typewriter captions, hand lettering. David was cranking out thousands of these things, and he claimed that when he wrote, he felt that he had a personal, intimate, tangible touch with every human heart in the whole family. If you've ever seen the scans, which obviously if you're watching on YouTube, I'll insert pictures of, they look like something between an underground comic and a manifesto written from a bunker. But inside the cult, they were insanely popular. So popular, the Mo letters eventually replaced every outside authority or moral rule book, including the Bible, within the group, obviously. Colonies bound them into these fat leather-like volumes arranged like scripture. Little satin ribbon bookmark and all. The spine on them says Mo Letters, Volume 1. Letters 1 through 150, and on and on. Over the course of his life, David wrote nearly 3,000 Mo letters. You could line a fucking shelf with them. I've seen some people's collections online. These writings covered any and everything a child of God needed to know. Doctrine and how-to guides about discipline, parenting, hygiene, politics, end-time prophecies, who to trust, who to fear, who to have sex with, how often to do it, how to think, how to grocery shop, literally everything. According to davidberg.org, quote, David's primary goal in writing was to ground the membership in the fundamental teachings of the Bible and the mission of the movement, as well as to propose novel doctrinal interpretations and teachings on biblical prophecy related to Jesus' second coming in the end time. At the heart of his teachings was the unshakable conviction that the love of God, as manifested in the Bible and the person of Jesus, was the solution to every human need. Those are their words, okay? Also, I gotta, allegedly he did all this. Anything I said before and anything I say after, alleged. So what is the whole Jesus' second coming and the end time all about, right? I think we all know a doomsday prophecy when we see one. According to these letters, it starts with a big chain of prophecies where the world keeps getting louder and messier with signs all around us like war and disasters and pandemics. And I'm like, hold on. Are we, are we facing an end time here? I'm a little nervous. But then there's this super convincing global leader that's going to come along, the Antichrist, right? He's going to show up looking like the one guy who can fix everything. And he'll be wildly charismatic and amass a huge following. And then he's going to broker a huge Middle Eastern peace deal that triggers the final 7-year countdown. But halfway through, the leader will break the deal. He'll set himself up like he's God and start forcing a one-world religion, theological, right? Monotheistic control system, including some kind of mark situation where you can't buy or sell anything without it. And then there will be the Great Tribulation, which is supposed to be this brutal social pressure on anyone who won't go along. There'll be a big spiritual showdown, escalating divine judgments. Babylon, his code for the materialistic world system, often symbolized as the United States, will get wiped out. The whole money and materialism empire will crash. And then after the tribulation, Jesus comes back. Okay, he raptures the faithful. He nukes the Antichrist at Armageddon. He locks up Satan and launches a literal 1,000-year kingdom on earth. And after that millennium ends, Satan gets one last chance to cause chaos, gets obliterated for good, and then boom, final judgment. Earth is remade, paradise forever, amen. God bless, utopia. According to the family's own website, he himself, David, believed that the end time events would unfold in our lifetime, and he wanted the group to have a thorough working knowledge of exactly what was coming so they wouldn't be caught unaware. And then came one of the most consequential Mo letters of all time. In 1972, David released a Mo letter titled Flee as a Bird to Your Mountain. Former members say it was written like a direct order from God. Not advice, not a sign, but a command. I couldn't find it to read, but allegedly it said something about America being on the edge of annihilation. The system was about to collapse and God's judgment was aimed straight at the United States. So staying in the country wasn't just dangerous, it was disobedience. The faithful must leave. immediately, scatter across the globe before it's too late. And as always, after all the wars and plagues and global purges, Jesus would come back and the children of God would inherit the earth. That's what's going on here. Okay, feel caught up? Do you feel in the know? Families obviously panicked. They packed up their entire lives overnight. Parents who were already terrified of failing God and the man they believed was literally God's prophet yanked their kids out of school, out of any form of stability. They broke their leases. They quit jobs, sold everything, and just walked away. David warned them to avoid systemites, aka grandparents, siblings, social workers, police, reporters, anyone who might interfere with his plan. He told them the system was trying to steal their children, and leaving the country was the only way to keep them safe. So these families, they fled. They fled in vans, in buses, hitchhiking, one-way plane tickets to Europe, Africa, South America, any country that didn't ask too many questions. And the strategy worked almost too well. By the mid-1970s, the Children of God claimed they had around 130 communities operating in roughly 70 countries with an estimated 10,000 full-time members. Entire families living communally with almost no paper trail, no outside schooling, no consistent legal oversight, no fixed addresses, just off-the-grid communities, almost entirely dependent on a man they never saw, and the Mo letters that told them how to live and think. And mind you, that's one of the craziest things we have to come back to and realize is that he was so out of the picture at this point. I mean, he was very involved. He was still very much leading the group and had emphasis and say on everything. But people joined without ever seeing or physically meeting him. And now they were facing this huge period of isolation. And the deeper the cult got into isolation, the more unhinged those Mo letters became. After the Texas Soul Clinic era, David and his side piece, Karen Zerby, a much younger disciple who he had met in Tucson during his Teens for Christ days, she was known in the cult as Mama Maria. Well, they left the US entirely and spent nearly a year traveling across Europe, scouting for new missionary outposts. And that trip led them to Israel, where they stayed for several months, hoping to plant a colony there. David, or Moses at the time, had this romantic fantasy that Israel was the perfect spiritual home for his end-time army. And then he found out the Israeli government was firmly opposed to Christian proselytizing and that the socialist kibbutzim were nothing like the communal paradise he'd imagined. He blamed system persecution, of course, but while he was in Israel, David had what he claimed was a doctrinal revelation. In 1971, he released the Mo letter, One Way, claiming that Christians shouldn't even think of themselves with labels such as Jewish, Gentile, black, white, male, female, none of it. Okay, inclusive. All are one in Christ Jesus, he wrote, basically announcing that earthly identities were obsolete now that he was here to lead God's final generation. The Family International still quotes this letter as evidence that David Berg wasn't racist. Except that's not where this story goes. As the colonies multiplied worldwide and David's teachings went unchallenged, some Mo letters swerved straight into open conspiracy territory. He started ranting in his letters about international Jews controlling world governments and banks, the whole classic anti-Semitic playbook, and lumped black people into the same imaginary global enemy. He wrote about this whole coordinated plot to sabotage Christianity, undermine America, and destroy God's chosen end-time army, aka his own followers. At one point, he reportedly flat out said, "Yeah, I'm an anti-Semite because God is." I don't know, Kanye West behavior, okay? And this was the kind of thing he would drop into a Mo letter in between a couple of Archie comic-looking doodles. There was a lot going on here. Anyway, by the early 70s, they're fully onto this whole end-time storyline, right? And then comes the news that there is this comet called the Cahutek Comet, and they were calling it the Comet of the Century. Astronomers said it might be extremely bright, and NASA was very cautious. Scientists were cautiously optimistic, and the media was fucking hyped, you guys. But David wasn't buying it. He was like, this isn't an astronomical event, okay? No way. This, cult babes, was God's cosmic alarm clock, divinely timed to warn humanity of the countdown to destruction. Total and utter chaos is coming, okay? When NASA started to downplay the dangers, they're like, oh, it's not coming to Earth, nothing's gonna happen, David called them blind servants of the system and insisted they couldn't see the spiritual truth. He prophesied that Cahutek would unleash catastrophic earthquakes, famine, flooding, and even nuclear war, especially aimed at the United States for its materialism and sexual depravity. When the comet came and went with nothing but a fizzle, the whole event was a huge letdown for everyone, really. He flipped it into God has postponed judgment out of mercy for the faithful, and still fully insisted the bigger collapse was right around the corner. So just hang on, okay? You're just gonna have to wait a little bit. It's coming any day now. Stay vigilant, stay inside your little communes, okay? Trust nothing but the word of me, the word of Mo. I am the one, the source, the knowledge, I know all. And right around the mid-70s is when David really started pushing the doctrine that would later become the belief system for everything fucking terrible that followed. Okay, it was the law of love. The official line, still posted on the Family International's website, by the way, which is what the Children of God later turned into, is that the law of love meant, quote, whatever is done in pure love, the love of God, unselfish love, sacrificial love is lawful. In David Berg speak, selfishness was the only real sin, okay? Therefore, if any act was done in love, it wasn't just permitted, it was holy, it was God's will. And when David said anything, he meant anything. Physical boundaries, gone. Cultural norms, out of here. Traditional Christian sexual ethics, see ya later. Irrelevant under the New Testament freedom he claimed Jesus had granted. It was the 70s, get with the times. He told his followers that erotic intimacy literally mirrored God's love. He allegedly taught that Adam and Eve had non-stop, heaven-blessed sex in Eden. How you like them apples? He told them monogamy was a man-made limitation, and withholding your body, your literal holy temple, was the real sin. Sharing is caring, baby. Even spouses, wife swapping for God. Amen. And pass the pineapple print key bowl. Oh, and if you were willing to sleep with whoever leadership said you should without complaint, even better. That meant you had conquered selfishness. You'd reached a higher spiritual plane. Were you feeling jealous, discomfort, or I don't want to do this? Well, it meant that you were unspiritual, carnal, in fact. System infected, you needed to yield. There was no room for sexual reluctance because reluctance was just a lack of faith. The more open, the better. And this wasn't done in secret. This didn't fully come out of nowhere either. Early experiments with sexualized witnessing, as they called it, had long been happening inside of David Berg's household, especially among the young women on David's personal staff, most notably Karen, or Mama Maria, as she was later called by the group. In January of 1975, in the Canary Islands, she gave birth to a son named Ricky Rodriguez, later renamed David Ito, who was groomed from birth as the spiritual heir of the cult. And we'll get to that whole tragic saga later on. But during those same years, David was pumping out some of the most disturbing sexual Mo letters ever written. One early example was the Revolutionary Sex series, where David argued that total sexual freedom, including between adults and children and family members, was God's plan for a restored world. These letters didn't just hint either. They openly sexualized children and positioned child-adult intimacy and incest as spiritually beautiful. You sick fucks. By 1976, David was ready to take sexual evangelism global. He formally rolled out FFing, which was short for flirty fishing, as a church-sanctioned way to profess your love for God. FFing was pitched as a proposition to the law of love, basically proof that God wanted believers to use sex as a literal hands-on expression of divine love. He tied it to Matthew 4:19. Jesus is called to become fishers of men. David's interpretation was bait equals your body, hook equals seduction, and catch equals your conversion, and hopefully a donation. Movement slogans at the time were things like hookers for Jesus, sacrificial lovers for Christ, and my personal favorite, God's whores. Women, and sometimes men, were sent to bars, hotels, nightclubs, seaside resorts, business conferences, anywhere with foot traffic, and lonely men And these FF manuals instructed women to dress seductively, initiate conversations, offer affection, and go all the way if the spirit leads. And the spirit, he was always leading, honey, okay? Spirit lead me where my flirt and fish takes me. David was kind of like a pimp in this situation. He demanded detailed statistics. Mo letters ordered homes to send monthly tallies of fish, men that had been contacted, bait, women that had been deployed, and times loved, aka sexual encounters. Okay, the ultimate cucks. He wants to know about the souls won. He wants to know about support received, aka did they get any money for having sex with them? David was a little sicko, a little freak. Internal family data released later on recorded nearly 224,000 sexual contacts between 1974 and 1987, all labeled witnessing. And that is just a lot of proselytizing. I don't know how they got anything else done. It became a literal job for people. Communes functionally became brothels with a ministry label slapped on the door. FFing wasn't just to bring in converts, it was to bring in cash. Homes were ordered to make it pay. Some women were sent out night after night. Moms would disappear after dinner and come back at dawn. You know, kids were clocking it. They could smell the perfume, the outfits, the worn down tiredness. And a lot of survivors say that FFing didn't just mess up families, it wrecked the parent and child bond because children learned fast that they came second to the men that their moms were required to quote unquote love. Many have said it was humiliating and confusing long before they even had language for why. And of course, pregnancies were happening left and right, and these were called Jesus babies or love children. With the fathers often unknown and the mothers busy doing cult activities, babies just kind of got raised in this communal nursery under rotating caregivers at all of the different communes. And eventually, they did stop practicing FFing in the 80s due to the spread of AIDS and public scandals drawing more attention to them. Speaking of scandals, in 1978, after years of internal power struggles, bad press, and constant pressure from concerned parents and authorities, including a 1974 New York State investigation known as the Wallenstein Report, which flagged the Children of God for financial exploitation and pedophilia based on interviews with ex-members, noting that Berg's Mo letters openly pushed a sexual ethos far outside of anything mainstream churches would tolerate. David decided to salvage the movement's image by blowing it up and rebranding, and he blamed everything on the leadership. He accused the chain of abusing authority, resisting his sexual doctrines, failing to enforce the law of love strongly enough, cooling down the revolution for Jesus, and the worst insults in the Mo dictionary, becoming just another denomination. In what members later called the R&R, the Reorganization Nationalization Revolution, timed to David's birthday, February 18th, he ordered every colony worldwide to fire its existing shepherds that day and hold new elections, like a divine purge of sorts. And then he basically dissolved the Children of God's name entirely and pretended the movement had been reborn. About an eighth of the entire membership walked out in the chaos. Many of those people later became major whistleblowers. Actress Rose McGowan was actually born into the group in 1973, while her parents were living with the group's Italian branch in Florence. In the version Rose has described publicly, her father ran the Italian chapter, and the family lived on a former duke's property just outside of Florence with roughly 50 to 60 adults and kids in the commune. The adults were focused on end times religion, and the kids were often kept separately from their parents and left pretty much unsupervised and up to their own devices, to the point where Rose later said she had, quote, no memory of her parents up until the point they got out of it. She does remember seeing the gender hierarchy early on, though. Men with multiple wives, women expected to serve men sexually, all of it. She started rebelling as a little kid, including burning a wall of Bibles. She says they got out when it became clear the group was encouraging adult-child sexual relations. At age 9, she fled in the middle of the night with her father, siblings, and step-siblings, and her father's other wife. She described running through a cornfield in thunder and lightning, and the group sending people to find them, a man later trying to break in with a hammer to get them. She said the normal world assimilation afterwards was hard, and that the experience left a lasting impression, as we know. And it was kind of a similar situation with the Phoenix family. River, Joaquin, Rain, Arlene and John Phoenix, their last name was actually Bottom at the time, also joined the Children of God in the early 70s, shortly after Rain's birth. And the family traveled as missionaries, and multiple stories describe them as being named archbishops for Venezuela and Trinidad during that period. Joaquin was born in 1974 in Puerto Rico, so they were making their rounds. The family's kids were very small when they were in it, but Joaquin's version of the story is basically that his parents were idealists who thought that they'd found a like-minded religious community, and they disillusioned and left once they realized there was something more to it than a benign faith group. In a Playboy interview, he stressed that he never witnessed the notorious practices and that he's always found the guilty by association's tone unfair to his parents. They quit in 1977 after the Mo letters started getting fishy. They were like, no, we're out of here. And then after leaving, they resettled in the US and the family eventually pushed into entertainment work. Anyway, there were some people leaving after the rebrand. A lot of them stayed. But after these pervy Mo letters freaked a bunch of people out and they left, the Children of God got a shiny new name, the Family of Love, named after the Law of Love. Doubling down and naming your cult after your most controversial doctrine to date is fucking crazy work. Okay, communes at this point didn't know who was in charge, who was out, what rules applied, and which Mo letters to obey. Colonies were ordered to split into smaller homes, which made them harder to monitor and easier to move. But under the new logo, everything else pretty much stayed the same. The Law of Love stayed. The Mo letters stayed. Communal child rearing stayed. End time prophecy stayed. David remained hidden, and the only thing that changed was the letterhead. And then they rolled out a new squeaky clean, wholesome spiritual family aesthetic, full of traveling kids choirs, the family singers and matching outfits. I mean, it's fucking Brady Bunch, okay? Children singing in perfect harmony at churches, schools, embassies, civic clubs, and even official government events for leaders. This wholesome facade was supposed to help recruit and legitimize the movement. And here's the wild part. This makeover actually worked. The movement spread even faster. Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, missionaries flooded into these countries with little oversight or weak child protection laws, and they absolutely thrived there. When the Family of Love finished rebranding and scattered into thousands of these tiny homes, the group entered its next era, camcorder culture. By the early 80s, video cameras were popping up everywhere inside of the cult. Homes bought them up with communal funds, and leadership encouraged constant recording. Constant surveillance, devotionals to David, song and dance performances, skits, teachings, footage of discipline, homemade sex tapes of couples sharing, masturbation testimonials, child stripteases, you name it. Everything was on there. David wanted a window into the homes, and video was the way to give it to him. And it got weirder and sicker from there. This is where we're going to wrap it up for the week. I will see you next week with more on the Children of God or the Family of Love. I'll see you next time. And until next time, there are certain things that you should absolutely not keep within the family. Goodbye.